I'm Zenoria Martin, and I'm a conveyancer at STBB, practicing from our Cape Town office. My objective here today is to explain to you the importance of having a conveyancer, or rather appointing a conveyancer, when you are dealing with your property transactions, and then also explaining to you exactly what a conveyancer is. Contrary to what many may believe, the ownership of property is not transferred the moment when you sign your deed of sale or your offer to purchase, for lack of a better word, but rather there is a formal registration process that needs to take place whereby the rights of ownership from from a seller is to be passed over to the purchaser. It takes a conveyancing attorney or a conveyancer to perform this function. What needs to happen is that the conveyancer needs to prepare certain deeds and documents, and that then needs to be registered in the deeds registry, which we can find in the deeds office. What a conveyancer in fact is an admitted attorney who's gone on to write a further examination, the conveyancing exam, and subsequently is admitted as a conveyancer. The conveyancer, in his or her capacity, ensures that the registration process runs smoothly, and there are many legal requirements that need to be met in this regard. So while the process is very intricate, there's many legal requirements that must be met for the purpose of security and certainty. Certainty in the sense that ownership has to be passed from the one entity to another. It would take a specialized attorney to ensure that that happens, that specialized property attorney then ultimately being the conveyancer. The job of the conveyancer is largely guided by what we know as the Deeds Registries Act, where the Deeds Registries Act sets out that it is only a conveyancer who can prepare certain documents and sign those documents off before the Registrar of Deeds in order for it to be a legitimate property transaction. Along with that, the conveyor accepts a number of responsibilities, particularly the responsibility of ensuring the correctness and accuracy of the information contained in the deeds that the conveyancer is in fact registering. The conveyancer is further guided by a number of pieces of legislation, which includes but is not limited to the Deeds Registries Act, as I've mentioned, the Sectional Title Schemes Act, as well as the Alienation of Land Act. And all the regulations that are attached to those acts also guide the framework within which a conveyancer works. Furthermore, the conveyancer is also guided by registrar's circulars, or more particularly the chief registrar's circulars and registrar's conference resolutions, which is set up by the necessary authorities who fall under the auspice of the deeds office. Very importantly to note is that while there is a big umbrella rather for a conveyancer, conveyancers can perform one of three different functions in a typical conveyancing process. Those three functions relate to the transfer attorney, the bond attorney, as well as the bond cancellation attorney. To explain those functions in a bit more detail, the transfer attorney is responsible for exactly that, the transfer of ownership from the seller's name into the name of the purchaser. So what this entails is that the transferring attorney will act in favor of the seller, who is the person who instructs the transferring attorney, and has to see to all the interests of the seller. By the same token, the transfer attorney also needs to ensure that the interests of the purchaser is looked after. However, if a conflict of interest ever arises between the two, it is the transfer attorney's obligation to see to it that the interest of the seller, who is the person instructing the transfer attorney, are put right on top of the list of his or her priorities. In most cases, as you may know, purchasers require financing for the purchase of their property, and this is where the bond attorney comes in. The bond attorney will act for the bank that is financing the purchaser's property by means of a mortgage loan, or what we know in more common terms of a bond. It then goes without saying that if the purchase of the property is being financed as a cash sale or by any other means of finance, there won't be a bond attorney involved. Last but definitely not least is the bond cancellation attorney. Now, bond cancellation attorneys are there for the instance where the seller, who is selling the property in question, still has a bond registered over his or her property. The bond cancellation attorney, of course, will not allow for registration to go through if his bond is not cancelled. The bond cancellation attorney, acting for the bond cancellation bank, will then ensure that cancellation figures are settled in relation to the bond, and subsequently that a cancellation is registered. What is very important is that even though these attorneys are three completely different people, although they may sometimes be one, it's very important that the link between them is understood. They have to work very closely together with one another, because if one of them drop the ball, it affects the entire transaction. It's then clear that the three attorneys do not work in isolation with one another, but are very closely linked. Apart from these three attorneys working together with one another, the attorneys also have external role players who they need to consider. So typically, a conveyancer would have dealings with the receiver of revenue, or SARS. It will also be your municipalities or your city councils. They also need to consider the banks, of course, that being the mortgage banks, as well as your managing agents or homeowners associations. Conveyancers and their secretaries have a very demanding job. They are constrained by very stringent timeframes, and therefore, to make the job easy for one another, or easier for one another, would be for the transferring attorney, the bond cancellation attorney, as well as the bond attorney, those all being conveyancers, to work together, for their staff to interact with one another, and then obviously to ensure that the external role players are also bringing their part. The implication of one of those conveyancers messing up, or of having a delay, let's say, with the bank or SARS in issuing transfer duty, for example, results in the entire transaction being delayed, which could have severe implications for the seller, the purchaser, as well as the mortgaging banks. What is very important as well is that a seller, who is the person who appoints the conveyancer, takes very special care as to what to look out for when he or she is in fact appointing the conveyancer. In a typical registration process, you would have about 50 activities that need to be carried out, and these activities are carried out by about 12 role players, some of which I have mentioned before. As the seller, who is appointing the conveyancer, he would want someone, or she would want someone who they can depend on in terms of advising them accordingly, ensuring that the process runs smoothly, and someone who they can rely on for a legitimate transfer of their rights from themselves unto the purchaser. A good conveyancer will explain to every party involved exactly what is required of them. For example, the type of documents that needs to be submitted, that particularly looking at the Financial Intelligence Center Act, how that document needs to be certified or authenticated, and also why you are submitting that document. Also, why you are signing a particular document. All too often we take for granted that we are signing documents and we don't know exactly what we are signing. And therefore it's a good thing to have a conveyancer who explains all those things to you. A conveyancer who does not explain it to you is a conveyancer who is not in fact performing their job correctly. Very important then is that the conveyancer protects the interests of the seller in particular. As I said earlier, the instructing party, which is the seller, is the one whose interests the conveyancer has to look after, while also ensuring that without creating a conflict of interest, the purchaser's rights and interests are also looked after. The conveyancer will explain to every party what their obligations are and also what their rights are in terms of the transaction. And very much importantly, the conveyancer will also see to it that the drafting of the OTP and the conditions contained in that OTP are in fact what they need to be in order to obtain his objective, or to reach the objective of looking after the interests of all parties. Very importantly in this regard would be suspensive conditions. The conveyancer also has to ensure that the conveyancer keeps everyone updated at all times. And the particular three role players who always want to know what is happening in a conveyancing matter would be the estate agent, the purchaser, as well as the seller. The conveyancer needs to advise them as to what the anticipated date for registration of the documents are, or of the transaction is. And what is very much linked to that is that the conveyancer ensures that everything runs according to plan, where the timeline is set out for that particular date of registration. To make that a bit more clear, the date of registration must always be held by. So if you set out the date of registration in your offer to purchase, for example, conveyancers need to ensure that the deeds are registered on that particular date, or as close as possible to that date, bearing in mind that it's not always possible to register on the date that is set out. This, of course, is because of the number of role players that are involved and the number of uncertainty that could come into play when so many role players are in fact involved. The conveyancer will do everything to ensure that all parties, like I said, are updated at all times, that they are fulfilling their obligations, especially financial obligations that may need to be fulfilled. Just to track back on the financial obligations and the three roles of the conveyancers, I've mentioned earlier that these three attorneys need to act hand in hand with one another, that being the transfer attorney, the bond attorney, as well as the bond cancellation attorney. And an example of illustrating how that works is one can only imagine that a seller will not allow the property to be transferred from his name into the name of the purchaser if, for example, the purchase price has not been secured. And that is where the bond attorneys come in to make sure that that bond is being administered in the way that it should be administered. On the other hand, the purchaser will not make sure that that purchase price is paid over to the seller if the purchaser is not certain that the correct procedure is being carried out for the transfer of rights by the seller over into the purchaser's name. And then lastly, the bond cancellation attorney will then have to ensure that the bond that is currently over the property, so the bank who has that bond over the property, gets their cancellation figures and subsequently that bond is cancelled. So these are the ways in which a good attorney will make sure that or not a good attorney, a good conveyancer, to be more specific, will make sure that every step in the procedure is carried out as it should to ensure that all parties are happy in the way that has just been described and ultimately for registration to happen when it needs to happen. While I've been referring to it a number of times saying that it is the seller who chooses the conveyancer, many do often think that it is the purchaser who has that right to choose the conveyancer. Although the purchaser pays for the costs of the conveyancer and most of the conveyancing procedure, it is highly important and advantageous to the seller for the seller to, of course, choose who the conveyancer is. The seller is the one who has the most at risk. The seller is the one handing over his rights, and therefore the seller would find it very crucial to know exactly what is happening, when, and would want to have someone trustworthy as their conveyancer. To reiterate why the seller might find it highly necessary to choose the conveyancer is because a delay in the transfer would most largely implicate the seller. There are many instances, for example, where the seller has what we call a linked transaction, which simply put means that while the seller is selling his property, the sale of that property largely implicates his purchase of another property. Sometimes transactions can be financially linked, which basically means that the funds that the seller is going to get from the sale of his current property will fund the purchase of another property. Obviously, then, if there's a delay in the transaction, it could lead to major repercussions for the seller, where quite possibly the seller could lose out on that deal and lose the property that he was about to purchase or that he intended purchasing. So for this reason, it only makes sense that a seller would want to appoint a conveyancer who is trustworthy and reliable and who is able to carry out the functions, as I've mentioned earlier, in a timeous and efficient manner. While, for example, we look at STBB in particular, STBB is a reputable conveyancing firm. We have a good track record when it comes to the transfer and registration of documents in the deeds office and many other related property transactions. We have about 11 branches across the country, and we could go as far as saying that we are one of the biggest conveyancing firms within the country. Therefore, a firm such as ours would be a good idea for a seller because mainly of our reputation and our good standing that we do have in the property sector. While the seller does elect who the conveyancer is going to be, the purchaser, as I alluded to earlier, is responsible for the majority of the costs involved in the conveyancing transaction. Although I say the majority, one must not think that it is all of the costs. While we may have a podcast at a later stage where we set out exactly what the costs are that the purchaser and the seller respectively are responsible for, I will detail that briefly. The purchaser, for example, is responsible for paying the transferring attorney his or her legal fees, which is what we know as the transfer costs. They are also responsible for the payment of transfer duty to the receiver of revenue. They're responsible for the actual obtaining of a levy clearance certificate that is not to be confused with levy clearance figures. And in the same way, they're responsible for the purchase, if I could call it that, or the payment of the rates clearance certificate. Again, that is not the rates clearance figures. They are also responsible for the payment of all postage and petties involved in the transaction, all your deeds office searches, where we would do searches on the property itself, the purchaser as a person as well as the seller, and they're also obviously responsible for any documentation that needs to be drafted, so the drafting side of things. One other thing that the purchaser is also responsible for in the instance where a bond is being registered is the payment of the bond attorneys. So in a typical registration of a property or in the typical transaction process, you would have the purchaser paying the transfer attorneys, so that would be the transfer fees, and then also the bond attorneys, that being related to the bond registration. In essence, then the purchaser ends up having, if it's not the same conveyancers who are doing the bond and the transfer, the purchaser ends up having two statements of account at the end of the transaction. The seller, on the other hand, is responsible for the payment of the estate agent's commission. They are responsible for the payment of the advance rates and taxes, and that is what I was speaking about earlier when I said that you need to differentiate between the payment for the rates clearance certificate and the payment of rates clearance figures. And by the same token, the seller is responsible for the levy clearance figures, so that would be whatever is owing to the body corporate or to the managing agents, if, for example, we are dealing with sectional title property. One last thing that the seller is also responsible for would be for obtaining compliance certificates, and we're looking in particular at your plumbing compliance, your electrical compliance, gas installation certificates, beetle certificates, and in some cases also borehole certificates, whichever may be necessary. The best advice that I can offer you now that we have gone through the importance of having a conveyancer and appointing a conveyancer for your transaction would be to decide on who your conveyancer is going to be and make contact with your conveyancer as soon as reasonably possible. So once your transaction gets going, your conveyancer can have a bird's eye view of exactly what is happening. Your conveyancer can tell you exactly what is required of you in terms of documentation, in terms of bodies who you need to contact. For example, in the case of a seller, the conveyancer will prompt you to issue an instruction to the bank that holds a mortgage bond over your property for that bond to be cancelled. Very importantly in that regard is that if you do not give certain amount of notice to the bank that you are going to be cancelling your bond, there are some penalties that will have to be paid. And obviously, time is money, and the seller would not want to lose money in that regard. Another reason why you want a good, reputable conveyancer who has the necessary experience and knows exactly what he or she wants to do. So in conclusion, to sum everything up, you would now understand the importance of appointing a conveyancer and what the functions of a conveyancer is, and very importantly, for your sake as a seller and even for a purchaser, why it is important to have a conveyancer who knows exactly what he is doing and has the necessary expertise handling your property transaction. Should you have any further questions or concerns, or simply want to chat to any one of our conveyancers here at STBB, you may contact us at stbb.co.za.